Welcome everyone to Anatomy and Physiology 1. Today we're going to be going over the Chapter 1 PowerPoints, which is going to contain information on the introduction to the human body. So we're going to be introducing the human body today, the different systems that make it up. We're going to talk a little bit about how the body regulates its own internal environment, and we're going to talk about a term known as homeostasis, which refers to a condition of balance within the body's internal environment. So some of the goals for today is we're going to introduce the different disciplines of anatomy and physiology. We're going to talk about what these two regions of science are going to be referring to and how they go together and why they go together so well. We're also going to be talking about the different levels of structural organization of the human body and how smaller and smaller pieces come together to make what we know as the human body. We're going to talk about some of the characteristics that determine what determines whether or not an organization is alive or not. So we're going to talk about some of the shared properties of living things, and we're going to talk about homeostasis, which again is this condition of equilibrium within the body's internal environment. So we're going to touch on all of these throughout the course of this presentation. So first and foremost, what I want to touch on first is what is anatomy and what is physiology? How do these two terms go together, and why do we call this class anatomy and physiology? Why don't we just call it anatomy or physiology? How do we look at these terms? So anatomy refers to the study of the body's structure, while the physiology refers to essentially the function of that structure. So the body's function is going to be referred to as the physiology. So anatomy is what is present in the body, and the physiology is how those things come together to work to give us what we know as our human body and to function as we know that it functions. So there are different branches of anatomy, and there's different branches of physiology as well. Some of the branches here are systemic anatomy, we have regional anatomy, surface anatomy, imaging anatomy, and pathological anatomy. So this is just to show you that there are many different branches of anatomy. So for example, one example I'm going to show you here is surface anatomy. Surface anatomy is essentially the study of the markings of the body as they are viewed from the surface. So being able to touch and palpate, to listen to and feel the body and particular places and feel particular structures. So this is the way that we can visualize the body without actually cutting into the body, and so without actually seeing what's inside. Pathological anatomy, this word here, pathological, refers to some type of disease. So pathological anatomy refers to some type of structural change or disorder that's going to be causing some type of disease, or that might be associated with some type of disease. So these are two examples here. Imaging anatomy is going to be another example that we have. Another branch of anatomy that utilizes different imaging techniques such as X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans. There is going to be some slides at the end of this presentation that will have some information for you about medical imaging. However, I will not be including any medical imaging questions on my test, so that is strictly for your own study purposes. So systemic anatomy refers to sort of the structure of all of our body systems together. For example here, the structure of specific systems, such as the nervous or respiratory system. So we will come to learn that there are 11 different body systems. We have the nervous system, we have the respiratory system, we have the cardiovascular system, the muscular system, and the skeletal system, and even more. And so systemic anatomy refers to the study of one of these specific systems. That's what we call it, systemic anatomy. So this is where you might get your cardiologist that's going to study the cardiovascular system, or you might have your pulmonologist that will study the lungs and so forth. Regional anatomy is going to focus on a particular region of the body, such as, of course, the head, chest, arms, legs, and so forth. Some different branches of physiology are molecular physiology, neurophysiology, endocrinology, and cardiovascular physiology. And there are many more than are just listed here. However, these are just some examples that we see. So why don't we come here to, we'll go to endocrinology first. So endocrinology refers to the study of the endocrine system and how the endocrine system is going to function. So what we will come to learn is the endocrine system is going to function by releasing hormones. Hormones are different chemicals that are found within the body that help for communication between one part of the body and another, one system to another. So hormones are going to be released by different endocrine organs. So endocrinology will be the study of how these different hormones are actually going to be affecting different parts of the body. Neurophysiology, this prefix here, neuro, refers to our nervous system. So neurophysiology refers to different properties of nerve cells, or our neurons, as they are called. So there's lots of different branches of physiology and lots of different branches of anatomy, and they all will come together to give us what we know as the human body. So cardiovascular physiology is going to be referring to, as the physiology, referring to the cardiovascular system, how the heart works and how the blood vessels work with the heart. So these are all different branches of physiology, just to show you a few of how many different ways we can slice the different functions of the human body. So this here is going to be a very important slide for us because we're going to be touching on this through the semester. So the levels of structural organization refer to the different levels by which we can look at the different structures of the body. So you can see here, this first level is the chemical level. The second level is the cellular level. The third level is the tissue level. The fourth level is the organ level. The fifth level is the system level. And lastly, the sixth level is the organismal level. So each of these levels build upon themselves to create the next most upper layer. So for example, the chemical level refers to the different atoms and molecules that all come together to make up macromolecules. So you can see here on the right side, this is going to be a strand of DNA. So different molecules must come together to form such a molecule here. So these different little atoms can form and make connections with each other to form different molecules. And then those molecules can form larger molecules such as DNA. There are other macromolecules as well, such as proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, which we will be touching on in later chapters. So the chemical level refers to all of the chemistry that's going on within the body. And as we build these larger proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates and DNA all up together to make a larger structure, we get to the cellular level. So the cellular level is when we really are able to say that something is truly alive. This is where we start to get to the idea that certain things can be living, certain things can metabolize energy and create different energies. So different cells here, there's going to be many different types of cells that are found within the body, but the cellular level is going to be the next second level here. So next up is going to be the tissue level. The tissue level refers to a collection of cells. When lots of the same type of cell have all come together, they're going to form some type of tissue. So one example here we're using here is the smooth muscle cell. Well, when we take a bunch of smooth muscle cells and we put them all together, you can see that we have many different smooth muscle cells, and that's going to create smooth muscle tissue. So the tissue level is important because we're now taking these different cellular units and we're all combining them into this one tissue level. The fourth level here is the organ level, and this is going to be where we take many different types of tissues. So we might have a muscular tissue, we might have what's known as an epithelial tissue or a connective tissue, which you can see shown here. And we will go over tissues quite a bit more in Chapter 4. But tissues are just referring to a collection of particular types of cells. So the smooth muscle cell is going to be making up this organ, which is known as the stomach. So this here is what the stomach is going to look like, and you can see that there's a layer, actually there's a few different layers of smooth muscle that's found in the stomach that's going to help churn up food, to help you digest food whenever you swallow it. Epithelial tissue is going to form different linings of different organs. So you can see that this organ here is going to be lined by a certain types of epithelial tissue, and again we will touch more on these different types of tissues in Chapter 4. When we've gotten to the organ level, this is where we are now forming different organs made up of different types of tissues. So the stomach is an organ, the large intestine is an organ, the spleen is an organ. These are all different organs that are made up of multiple types of tissues. Now, when we have more than one organ that are going to be giving us a particular organ system, that's where we get into the system level. So the stomach is one of the many organs that make up the digestive system, and the systems are what we're going to really be focusing on today. So you can see that the system level here, this is showing us the gastrointestinal tract, or the digestive tract, and that's going to lead from the mouth all the way to the anus. So the mouth is going to be important in the digestive system, of course, because it's going to include the tongue as well as salivary glands. And when we eat food, we're going to put food into our mouths. We're going to swallow that. It's going to go into the esophagus. The esophagus is going to empty that food into the stomach. The stomach is going to push that into the small intestine, which is all of this stuff in here, this sort of long tube that you see in here. The small intestine is then going to lead us into the large intestine, which is also referred to as the colon, and then that's going to go out of the anus. So that's one example that we have this system level. So as we will also learn, the lungs and the trachea are both going to be part of the respiratory system. And so when we get these many different systems all together, we're going to be combining them, and that's what gives us the sixth organismal level. So the levels of structural organization help us to organize the body in different layers. So we can first understand the different chemical structures of each part of the body. We can understand that each part of the body might have different types of cells that make it up, and each cell is going to have different organelles and other characteristics to make it act differently from other cells. Those cells are all going to come together to give us some tissues, and those different tissues are going to come together to give us organs. And depending on the organs, that's going to tell us what system it is we're talking about. And again, all 11 body systems are going to come together to give us the organismal level. So the 11 body systems are going to be a very, very big focus here of your first exam. The 11 body systems are very, very important. So this is a slide for you all to see the 11 body systems. I wanted to put all these on one slide for you all, but we're going to go over each one of these in the next couple slides here. So first and foremost is the integumentary system. So this is going to be the first of the 11 body systems. There are 11 different systems that all work together to make up the human body. So this is what we're about to go over here. So the integumentary system refers to the covering of the body. So for example, some of the components that we see here are the skin. Skin is going to be its own organ that's going to be helping to make up this integumentary system. Fingernails, toenails, sweat and oil glands, all of these are going to be components of the integumentary system. We will learn more about the integumentary system in Chapter 5, but for now I want you to focus on the components of what makes up each of these systems, and I want you to focus on the functions of these as well. So some of the functions, I know there's a lot of functions here, so I'm going to try to highlight the ones that I think are most readily important. So first and foremost, the integumentary system is going to have its first function to protect the body. This is our first line of defense. Think about the last time you might have tripped and skimmed your knee on the pavement or something of the sort. What happens is you get your skin scraped. That's going to be the first thing that's going to be, it's going to be functioning as a layer between the inner body workings and the outside of the body. So the integumentary's protective system is going to be the first characteristic here. The first function of the integumentary system. We also have hair. Hair is going to serve a protective function because it serves as a sensor. It tells us when certain things are touching us. Fingernails, those are going to be helpful in creating a hard nail plate. The different sweat glands, these are going to be a protective function because these are going to help us to thermoregulate. So each of these components of the integumentary system is going to have some play here in the functions. So another example here is the regulation of body temperature. As I just mentioned, the sweat glands, these are going to help the body to thermoregulate. So you've probably heard this from when you were a small child, that when you sweat, you're actually going to be cooling yourself down. When your body temperature rises, your sweat glands are going to secrete, and that sweat is going to evaporate off of the body and take heat with it. So the regulation of body temperature is going to be important as well. Now, sweat glands and oil glands are going to both have another function, and that's going to be to eliminate certain waste products from the skin. So this is going to be another example of a function that we have. We will touch on this a little bit more in Chapter 5. But the integumentary system is also going to be helping to make vitamin D. We're going to talk about why that's important in Chapter 5. So I won't stress this too much on your first exam here. But we also have the detection of certain sensations. These different sensations are going to be detected by different sensors that are found housed within the skin. So these are some functions of the integumentary system. Again, I don't really need you to focus on making vitamin D right now. That's not one I really need you guys to understand. I'm not going to be stressing about storing fat and providing insulation. We can talk about these at a later time. But the functions, the other functions that are here are going to be fair game for your test. So I definitely want you to make sure you're comfortable with the components and the functions of the integumentary system. Next up is going to be the skeletal system. The skeletal system is going to be made essentially composed of the bones, joints, and cartilages that serve as a support for the body. So what I really like about the skeletal system is it works in conjunction with the muscular system and the nervous system to give us all of the fabulous movements that we are able to create. And we're going to learn a lot more about the skeletal system here in chapter 6. So some of the functions of our skeletal system are, of course, to support and protect the body. So support, because these are giving us a rigid structure for our muscles to attach to. They're giving a shape to our body. While they're also protecting. Think about the rib cage here, the thoracic cage. It's going to be protecting the heart and the lungs. Or we can think about the bones of the cranium that are protecting the brain. So the protective function is going to be very important here in the skeletal system, as well as a supportive function for the other body structures. One of the other very important functions here is providing a surface area for muscle attachments. These are providing a space for our muscles to attach to. If we didn't have bones, our muscles would not be able to attach to anything to allow them to function as they do. So the bones are going to be very important. There's going to be lots of tendons that are connected to our bones and to our muscles that allow us to produce some type of useful work and nice fluid muscle movements. There's also going to be certain cells that are going to be producing blood cells, and there's also certain minerals that are going to be stored, as well as lipids and fats within our skeletal system, and we are going to touch on these in later chapters as well. Next up is the nervous system. The components of the nervous system, of course, are going to be the brain and the spinal cord, but also the nerves within the body and the special sense organs. So our special sense organs are going to be things like our eyes, our ears, our nose, and so forth. Those are going to be our special senses. So the components here refer to the brain, the spinal cord, and all of the different peripheral nerves that project from the body. So a nerve is anything that's going to be coming out of the brain or the spinal cord to sort of innervate and give some type of sensation or muscle movement to a particular part of the body. So you can see these nerves have been superimposed onto this body. You can see these large nerves that are sort of projected here out. These are all known as peripheral nerves. Some of these are projecting from the spinal cord, and we call those spinal nerves. And some of these project from the brain, and we call those cranial nerves. And we will touch on those in later chapters as well. One of the biggest functions of the nervous system is to generate what's known as an action potential. An action potential is just a fancy word for a signal that a nerve sends to communicate with another cell. So our primary type of cell within the nervous system is our neuron, and we're going to learn a lot more about the neuron as we go through this class. But neurons are going to be very special nervous system cells that send signals out, and they're going to allow for different parts of the body to communicate with each other. If you've ever wondered how you are able to contract your muscles so fluidly, that's thanks to the coordination of the nervous system. So every time you blink your eyes, every time you make a muscle movement, every time you eat something or so forth, you are producing different action potentials to cause these different activities to occur. So we will learn a lot more about action potentials in chapter 12. But for now, I want you to take my word for it that an action potential is a signal that's sent out by a particular neuron. And this is going to be one of the most important functions here of the nervous system. Some other functions here of the nervous system are going to be to detect different changes in the body's environment. So the nervous system is a way that our bodies are able to sense and be consciously aware of what is around us and what is going on inside of us. So the nervous system plays a very big role in regulating our body's internal environment as well. So interpreting different changes within the body's internal environment, responding to different types of stimuli that are going to be attacking our bodies at all times. These are going to be different functions of the nervous system. What we're going to learn is that certain neurons are going to be sensory neurons, and they're going to be receiving signals from the outside environment, and certain neurons are going to control our muscles. And so the nice arc of sensory neurons producing action potentials that are going to act upon motor neurons are going to give us this nice ability for our body to receive some type of stimuli and to respond to it as well. Our next system is the muscular system. So some of the components of our muscular system is, you've guessed it, different muscles. So our skeletal muscles are going to be the most common ones that we refer to, but we also have two other types of muscles. So for your information, there are three types of muscles that are in the body. We have skeletal muscles, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle. And each one of these tissues is technically a muscle tissue. However, they have different characteristics that distinguish them from each other. So skeletal muscle is what we're really going to be referring to most commonly when we refer to the muscular system. But I want you to be aware that there are other types of muscle as well. So skeletal muscle is named because this is the type of muscle that attaches to the skeleton. We have different muscles that are going to attach to our bones through tendons, and those are going to be the types of muscle that we have voluntary control over. So these are the ones that allow you to drive your car, to pick something up from the floor, to write your notes down when you're looking at this class. So those are your skeletal muscles. But as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of muscles that are going to be found in our bodies that do not necessarily have voluntary control. So cardiac muscle is one example of this. This is the type of muscle that's found housed within the walls of the heart that cause the heart to beat. This is the type of muscle that causes the heart to beat. So cardiac muscle is only going to be found in the heart, and it has very specific characteristics that distinguish it from skeletal muscle. And we will touch on these specific differences in later classes, but for now, I would like you to know that the muscular system is made up of these three types: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. And we're really going to be focusing on the skeletal muscle being found on the skeleton, the cardiac muscle being found in the heart, and lastly, the smooth muscle being housed within our hollow organs. So certain organs such as our stomach and our different intestines that we have, those are going to be lined with a layer of smooth muscle that's going to help to digest food and to mix up food as it's running through the digestive system. So some of the functions here of the muscular system are, of course, to produce some type of useful movements. One thing that you guys will learn about muscles as we go is muscles' primary function is to contract. Now, another way we could say that is we have these long muscles here, and the primary function of these muscles is to shorten in length. And so when we shorten our muscles in length, because these are attached to certain bones, that's going to cause these bones to pivot and cause parts of our bodies to move. So participating in different movements, such as picking up a cup to drink water, or perhaps riding a bike. These are all different movements that our skeletal muscles are going to be coordinating. Walking is going to be a great example of this because we need to coordinate the muscle movements of the muscles in the legs here in order to give us this fluid motion we know as walking. So maintaining posture is going to be another example. As you guys, some of you guys might be laying down, in your beds or on the couch or something like that. But I assume some of you, as you watch this, are going to be sitting upright. And I guess for the sake of argument, I'm going to be telling you that I'm sitting upright right now. And so this is only possible due to the different muscles that are found in my back that are allowing me to maintain the posture as I sit here. So the muscular system works in conjunction with the skeletal system and the nervous system to give us what I like to call useful movements. There's a lot of movements. I like to say that if we just had the skeletal system, our bones would fall to the floor, and we wouldn't be able to have any nice movements with those. If we just had our muscular system, our muscles would constantly contract and then relax and contract and relax, and they just kind of sort of flap there on the floor. And so that wouldn't really be any type of useful movement. So when we mix these two systems together, when we attach our muscles to the skeletal system, this gives us some ability to produce what we know as useful movements that we can use to produce work. So one of the other functions of muscles is to produce heat. This is why you might be wondering why you shiver. So when you shiver, you are actually producing more heat. So when it gets cold outside and you start to shiver, this is your body's response to produce more heat. And this is also why when you go into exercise, your body temperature is going to rise. Because when you use your skeletal muscles, that's going to increase body temperature and by producing heat. Our next system is the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is including the heart, the blood vessels, as well as blood itself. So blood is actually, in fact, part of the cardiovascular system. Now, the cardiovascular system is something that we're going to touch on in Anatomy and Physiology 2, and we will not be touching on much more in this class. But I do want you guys to have an idea of the cardiovascular system, what components make it up, and some of the functions that are going to be coming from this system. This is one of my favorite systems, so I want to make sure to give this the time that it deserves. So some of the functions of our cardiovascular system, of course, the heart's main purpose is to pump blood through our blood vessels. That is what's going to be producing different energy. We're going to be delivering oxygen to our muscles and to different tissues that are going to be allowing our muscles to produce some type of energy source. So blood pumping through the vessels is going to be constantly important, and this is why our hearts are constantly pumping at all times. So blood's main function here is going to be to serve as a transport. So when we get into the molecular level of blood, there's a particular molecule known as hemoglobin. Blood is containing this hemoglobin is going to be made up of different cells and so forth, and oxygen is going to be attaching to this protein known as hemoglobin. And different nutrients are going to be attaching to these blood cells as well, and these are going to be transporting this oxygen and nutrients to different body tissues, as well as picking up different wastes when they get to the tissues and taking them back to be excreted through the lungs in different places as well. So there are a lot of functions here of the cardiovascular system. You will learn this a little bit more readily in Anatomy and Physiology 2, but I do want to just mention one more function down here is that blood has certain components that will help to defend against different types of diseases or particular infections. So we have white blood cells and we have red blood cells, and our white blood cells are going to be the types of cells that are going to be functioning to fight off different foreign invaders that make their way into our bodies. So the cardiovascular system is also very, very important, and again, you will get more of this in Anatomy and Physiology 2. The endocrine system is another system that you'll have included within Anatomy and Physiology 2, but I would like you to know the components of the endocrine system and the functions. So one thing that you will learn about my classes is that I'm going to test you upon the information that is shown within my PowerPoint slides. So you can feel comfortable knowing that the information that's going to be on your test is coming from these slides. They might not be word for word, but they are going to be essentially representing the concepts that are presented here in class. So the big idea here with the endocrine system is you can see that there's quite a few different parts. So there's a lot of different components. But one thing that all of these components have in common is that all of these different glands here, that's what all of these are different glands, these are all going to produce hormones. Hormones, as I mentioned earlier, are different chemical messengers that are going to be helping the body to communicate with each other. Different parts of the body are going to be able to communicate with each other through these hormones. So the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thymus, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, adrenal glands or suprarenal glands, pancreas, and the ovaries and testes are all going to be making up the endocrine system. Now, I know that was a lot of organs, so I'm going to take a little bit more time to reference the pictures here on the right. So the thyroid glands here are found in the base of the neck, and that's going to be found here. The hypothalamus is going to be found up in the brain, connecting to the pituitary gland through a little stalk. We have the parathyroid glands, which are going to be found here next to the thyroid gland or on the thyroid gland. Our adrenal glands are going to be found just above the kidneys, and our pancreas is going to be found sort of behind the stomach. The testes in males and ovaries in females are going to be part of the reproductive system. So there's lots of different glands that are found within the endocrine system. So again, we're not going to be touching much more on the endocrine system, but I would like you to know these different glands, and I want to make this a little easier on you in that their function is pretty much all going to be the same. The function of all endocrine organs is to essentially regulate our body activities by releasing hormones, and those hormones are essentially going to be diffusing into the bloodstream. So the way I like to characterize this question on my tests is by asking you, what is the function of the endocrine system or something of the sort? And the answer to this question is that the endocrine system is going to be releasing hormones. Those are going to be secreting hormones that are going to diffuse into the bloodstream, and those help to regulate body activities. If you can understand what I just said, that's all you'll need to know about the endocrine system for this entire class. So I want you to know these components, but all of the functions of all of these components are all going to be the same. They all function to release different hormones that act on the body differently. And of course, hormones that come from each of these systems are going to be different. However, the grand scheme of things here, in the overall picture of the endocrine system, the function of these organs is to release hormones into the bloodstream, and that's going to help regulate body activities. So that is the endocrine system in a nutshell. Next up is the lymphatic system and the immune system. So these are going to be two systems that sort of work in conjunction together. So lymphatic fluid and vessels. There are another vessel, there's another network of vessels that are found within the body known as lymphatic vessels. The spleen, the thymus, the lymph nodes, and the tonsils are all going to be parts of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system, again, is going to be made up of these different components, and there's a few different functions to the lymphatic system. So to return different fluids to the blood. At certain times, blood is going to, and different fluids are going to be released from the cardiovascular system, and they're going to be collected within the lymphatic system to be brought back to the blood. We also have different cells that are going to be carrying out different immune responses. So B cells and T cells are going to be two major cells that help, that are making up what is known as our adaptive immunity. Again, you'll get this a little bit more in Anatomy and Physiology 2, but for right now I just want to introduce T cells and B cells to you all. Now, one thing that I'd like you to note is that on this slide here, you'll notice that I have included with the lymphatic system is this thing here known as the thymus. Well, when we go back here to the endocrine system, we also see that the thymus is included here with the endocrine system. So the thymus is going to be part of both the endocrine system and the lymphatic system. So don't allow yourself to get confused here. This organ is going to be playing a role in both of these systems. So this is going to be the main function here of the lymphatic system, is to return different fluids and proteins to the blood after it has been released from the cardiovascular system. The respiratory system is going to be our next system, another system that we'll get in Anatomy and Physiology 2. The major components of the respiratory system are the lungs, pharynx and larynx, trachea, and bronchial tubes. So you can see the respiratory system shown over here. As we breathe air into our lungs, as you guys are probably find that breathing is a rather simple task for us to carry out. However, it's actually a very, very complicated process. So when we breathe in, we're actually going to contract what's known as the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that is found separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, and I will show you this diaphragm in just a little bit. But when we contract the diaphragm, that's going to pull the lungs open, and that in turn pulls air into the lungs. And so these series of tubes are going to be found here, allowing air to make its way into the lungs. Now, the purpose of the respiratory system, I mentioned earlier that the cardiovascular system was actually functioning to bring oxygen to the different tissues of the body. Well, oxygen gets to the cardiovascular system through the respiratory system. So, transferring oxygen from the inhaled air to the blood, as well as transferring carbon dioxide from blood to the exhaled air. So, every time we inhale, we're going to be bringing in fresh oxygen. We're bringing in air, which has a roughly 20% oxygen content, and that oxygen is going to diffuse across the walls of the respiratory system, of what are known as alveoli, these little sacs found within the lungs. This air is going to flow across the walls of the alveoli, and it's going to diffuse into the blood. At the same time, carbon dioxide is going to be diffusing out of the blood vessels that has come from the tissues, and it's going to be offloaded at the lungs so that we can exhale it, because carbon dioxide, in terms of the body, is a waste product. So this also is going to help regulate our acid-base balance of our body fluids as well. So these different functions here of the respiratory system are very, very important, and they work very closely with the cardiovascular system. We could say technically that the respiratory system works very closely with all of the other systems, because we couldn't do anything if we weren't able to bring oxygen in through the respiratory system. Our last function here of the respiratory system is, of course, we can actually produce sound, or we can phonate, which is just a fancy science word for speak. So we can phonate with our respiratory system based on the way that we're going to breathe out of our lungs and use our vocal cords. So these are also going to be a function here of the respiratory system. The digestive system is going to be our next one, and I think the digestive system is a very interesting system. So the different components of the digestive system, as I've already talked about earlier in this class, are going to essentially be making up this really long tube. So the digestive system is just this long tube that leads from the mouth all the way to the anus. So the mouth, the pharynx, that's known as the throat. The pharynx is going to be allowing food to pass through it. That's going to take food into the esophagus once we swallow. The stomach, small and large intestines, and the anus are all going to be parts of the digestive system. So again, it's just this long tube that's going to be found through the body that allows us to digest food and excrete wastes. We also have certain accessory organs that are found here that are going to help with the process of digestion, such as the liver and the gallbladder, as well as the pancreas. These are all going to be different organs that secrete different types of digestive enzymes that are going to help us to digest food. Now, one other thing I'd like to mention here is that you see that the digestive system includes what is known as the pancreas. If we go back here to the endocrine system, you will once again see that the pancreas is included with the endocrine system. This is because the pancreas has both an exocrine and an endocrine portion. The pancreas's endocrine portion, of course, is going to be a part of the endocrine system, and the pancreas's exocrine function is going to be a part of the digestive system. So don't allow the thymus and the pancreas to confuse you here. These are two organs that are part of two different systems, so that is very important. So, of course, the functions here of our digestive system is, of course, to break down food into very small molecules so that we can absorb those nutrients. When we are breaking down food, we're breaking up our food. We can go sort of in the reverse order as our levels of structural organization. Let's say, I'm not sure if we have any vegans here in the class, but for our example, we're going to use a nice piece of steak. Now, those of you that like steak, let's say we are going to digest our steak. Steak is essentially going to be muscle tissue. There's lots of muscle tissue, muscle cells that are going to be found in steak. And so as we break down our muscle tissue, that's going to break our steak into cells, and then we're going to break those cells into the components that make up those cells, and then we're going to reuse those components to nourish our own bodies. So, of course, the anus is going to be important for allowing us to excrete solid waste in the form of feces. So the digestive system gives us the ability to digest food, absorb nutrients, and excrete waste all in one. Next is the urinary system. The urinary system is going to be made up of the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So these are going to be our four major components of the urinary system, and you can see those superimposed on this picture here towards the right. So the kidneys, their main function is actually going to be to filter out the blood. Blood's going to run through the different tubes here of the kidneys, the different vessels in the kidneys. That's going to help to filter the blood. And so the kidney is going to do a lot of different things, but eventually it's going to help us to produce urine. So it's going to be our first major function, is to produce, store, and eliminate urine. So the urine is essentially going to be produced here in the kidneys, and it's going to flow through this tube known as the ureter into the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is going to, I'll say more accurately, the urethra, which is going to be a tube connecting to the urinary bladder, is going to have different types of muscles within it, which allow you to control when you are releasing the contents of your urinary bladder. So this is also going to help maintain acid-base balance of body fluids. This is going to be a big theme here in Anatomy and Physiology too. But there's also going to be some degree of regulation of red blood cells. But again, our major function here is to excrete wastes as well as to eliminate urine and produce urine in the kidneys. So these are the major functions and components of the urinary system. The reproductive system is going to be our 11th and final system. This is going to be composed of lots of different reproductive organs, and the reproductive system is always a little bit of a challenge because we not only have one system to learn, but we have two systems to learn. So all of the other body systems are going to be fairly similar from male to female, but this reproductive system, this is where we're going to have to learn how these two reproductive systems are functioning separately and how they come together to form what is known as a new human, or we'd say a zygote. So gonads, testes in males, ovaries in females, are going to be the major components here. So there's a lot of components here to the reproductive system. So I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the ones that I find to be a bit more important. And that is going to be the fallopian tubes in the female, as well as the uterus in the female. In the males, we have the vas deferens and we have the seminal vesicles, as well as the prostate. So all of these different organs are going to contribute to the functions of the reproductive system. And the reproductive system of the male and the female are going to work together to give us, essentially, they're each going to be producing gametes, or sperm and egg cells, that are going to be allowing us to create a new human. So it's a very, very interesting system to study. So, again, the different gonads that we have, testes and ovaries, are going to be producing these different cells. So in males, these are sperm cells. In females, these are what are known as oocytes, or egg cells. So each of these two cells are going to come together, and that's going to help to create this new organism. So this is the reproductive system. Again, I know there's a lot of components up here, but I just want you to focus on the few that I did mention, and understand that the function of the reproductive system is, of course, to reproduce. That's the goal of our reproductive system. That's hence the name. We need to be able to reproduce, to propagate the species. So the reproductive system, you can see the components and the functions listed here. So that will conclude our 11 body systems. Make sure that you are comfortable with those. I definitely give a lot of test weight to the 11 body systems. So make sure you're comfortable with the components and the functions of each of the systems that I pointed out. Next up is going to be talking about the basic life processes. So what the basic life processes are referring to are essentially the characteristics that allow us to distinguish living things from non-living things. So we have 6 basic life processes. We have metabolism, responsiveness, movement, growth, differentiation, and reproduction. Some of these are going to be a little bit more straightforward than others. For example, responsiveness is essentially the ability for an organism to respond to some type of stimuli. Reproduction, of course, is going to be able to reproduce. But some of these other terms, like metabolism and differentiation, tend to be a little bit more deep in their understanding. So metabolism is going to refer to the combination of all of the chemical reactions that occur within the human body. And we're going to do metabolism in chapter 25, which is actually going to be the 4th chapter we're going to do. So we're going to do chapter 1, we're going to do chapter 2, chapter 3, and then we're going to do chapter 25. And that will include the major reactions of metabolism. Differentiation is the ability for certain cells to differentiate and be able to become specific different types of cells. The ability for a stem cell to become a new, more differentiated specific cell is going to be referring to differentiation. So growth, of course, is the ability for our cells to grow in size. Movement, of course, is our abilities for our organisms to move in some fashion. So these are all different basic life processes that are going to help us to distinguish whether or not some type of smaller organism is alive or not. Homeostasis is what is known as essentially a condition of equilibrium within the body's internal environment. So I would like to think that most of us are in a state of homeostasis right now. However, the next time that you might hear an intruder knocking on your door, or you get into some type of car crash, or you get sick, those are going to move you away from a position of homeostasis. So homeostasis is a very important place for our bodies to be. We want our bodies to be in a place of homeostasis. There are constantly different stimuli that are coming in to affect the body in different ways. Certain things are going to come in to bring the body, let's say temperature, for example. Certain things might come in to make the body colder. Certain things might come in to make the body more warmer. And it's important for our body to regulate where its body temperature is going to be. So our homeostasis is the way I like to look at homeostasis is sort of where the body is supposed to be. If we are to scratch our arm, that is going to be not a state of homeostasis where we have scratched our arm, because there will be inflammation and such. So this homeostasis is important because it's going to be maintained by different regulatory processes. Now, one thing I want to just mention for you all real quickly, in terms of metabolism, I want to get you guys started on metabolism, because that tends to be a little bit more of a dense chapter. Metabolism is going to be made up of what is known as catabolism and anabolism. So these are two words that make up what is known as metabolism. So catabolism refers to the crushing or breaking down of larger molecules into smaller pieces. Anabolism refers to the building up or assembly of smaller pieces into larger pieces. So these are going to be feeding into metabolism as a basic life process. And again, homeostasis is going to be maintaining all of these different things. So we have essentially homeostasis of metabolism that we will be talking about here in chapter 25. So some of the examples of homeostasis here, and this is sort of a very theoretical picture, but I love this picture because it really shows us in general what's going on here with the body. So we see many different organ systems that are imposed here. Once again, this is not exactly how the body is going to look, but this is an example of how the body is going to work. So homeostasis within the body's internal environment must be very, very specific. We have very, very specific ranges of different characteristics that our body can handle. If we get too hot, that can be potentially dangerous. If we get too cold, that can be potentially dangerous. If our blood gets too acidic, that can be a problem. If our blood gets too basic, that could be a problem. So it's important for us to keep within these very narrow ranges of what we know as homeostasis. So as we look at this picture, we see a few of the body systems that have been superimposed here. You see the cardiovascular system here shown in the center. We see our respiratory system shown up here, our digestive system, the urinary system, and different body cells. So these are some of the body systems that we've just talked about. So let's start here with the respiratory system. The respiratory system's major function is to bring oxygen into the body and allow that oxygen to be carried away by the blood to the tissues. One thing we're going to learn, again, in chapter 25 is that oxygen is required in order for our bodies to make energy. So you can see that O2 is our little suffix here, or abbreviation, I'll say, for oxygen. So oxygen comes into the lungs every time we breathe. Every time we inhale, we're going to bring oxygen into the lungs. There's going to be very thin walls here, and they're going to be very closely associated with very tiny blood vessels known as capillaries. So again, the cardiovascular system is going to be much more intricately shown as it is right here. But for our sake of understanding, this is a great picture. So oxygen is going to come in here and diffuse into the bloodstream as blood is pumped constantly through the heart. So the heart is going to, right here, is going to be pumping blood through the cardiovascular system. You can see that this oxygen is then going to be offloaded to our different body cells, such as muscle cells. When we are going to do our skeletal muscle cells, are going to be needing this oxygen to produce energy. So oxygen is going to be allowed to be taken to our body cells. Well, at the same time, CO2, carbon dioxide, is going to be a waste product that it was just formed from energy production. So this is going to need to be able to leave the body. So carbon dioxide is going to be diffusing back into the bloodstream, and it's going to be carried all the way back up here to the respiratory system to be exhaled. And this is why when you exhale, you're exhaling more CO2 than you inhaled. There are also other types of wastes that are going to be coming from our body cells that are going to need to be excreted in other ways. So for example, nitrogenous wastes will be excreted through the urinary system in this example. And that's going to be here through the kidney, the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. You can see with the digestive system, as we take nutrients in the form of food, one of my favorite foods that you guys will come to learn is the McGuire's baked potato. Those of you that are natives to Pensacola, you know what restaurant I'm talking about. And they have a very, very large and very tasty baked potato. And there's a lot of carbohydrates and other nutrients that are found within that baked potato. So I'm going to use that as an example here. So the McGuire's baked potato, every time we eat a McGuire's baked potato, that's going to enter the digestive system and it's going to get broken down. And the particular nutrients that we get from our baked potato per se is going to enter into the bloodstream. And then this is going to run its way around and be able to be offloaded to the body tissues as well. And anything that's not going to be used is going to be allowed to be excreted from the body in the form of waste. So this is a nice picture to show us what's going on inside the body in a more theoretical manner. Now there's one other thing on this slide that I'd like to mention to you, and that's essentially the body's external environment compared to the body's internal environment. So the external environment refers to anything that is not part of your body. The space right around your body is going to be referring to the external environment. Your computer, your desk, all of those things are going to be part of the external environment. And anything inside of the body, whether that be within the body systems, within the body cells, or outside of the body cells, but yet still contained within the body, is going to be referring to the body's internal environment. So the body is made up of many different cells. That's what our body is made up of. And in each of these cells are going to be particular components. But there's also going to be tiny spaces between these cells, and that's considered the body's internal environment. So for example, blood is going to be made up of blood cells as well as blood plasma. Plasma is just a nutrient-rich fluid that's going to be encasing all of our different blood cells. So blood plasma, while it's not necessarily inside of any cells, it's still considered part of the body's internal environment. So this is just a nice picture for you all to look at to hopefully help you understand the body systems in greater detail. Now we're going to talk about the different control of homeostasis in the form of feedback loops. Feedback loops are different methods by which our bodies are able to regulate homeostasis. And we have two types of feedback loops we're going to mention, a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. So we're going to take a minute to go over each of these. So every feedback loop starts with a stimulus that's going to affect some type of controlled condition. So the stimulus, like I said, is anything that's going to disrupt homeostasis by either increasing or decreasing any type of controlled condition. So if the controlled condition is going to be body temperature, the stimulus might be perhaps a hot bath or perhaps, a dip in an ice bath, perhaps. So both of those are going to be different stimuli that are going to increase or decrease some type of controlled condition, and the controlled condition in this example is body temperature. So we can assign with each of these components here of a feedback loop, we can assign a different condition and different stimuli, which will give us different receptors, a different control center, and different effectors to give us a different response. So the way I want you guys to be looking at this feedback loops here is understanding that this is a generalized feedback loop that we can apply to many different controlled conditions. So essentially, again, we'll just go over this one more time. Any stimulus is going to possibly increase or decrease some type of controlled condition. One example we might look at is heart rate. Well, some type of stimulus, such as a car crash, is going to significantly increase heart rate. And so if heart rate is going to be increased, this controlled condition is going to be monitored by some type of receptor. There are specific receptors that we are going to touch on that are going to be monitoring heart rate. These are going to relay the signal to some type of control center, and the control center is then going to send out signals to the effectors to essentially produce some type of response to lower that heart rate back to a more acceptable level. So that's the way our feedback loop is going to work. So we're going to first start with our example of a negative feedback loop, and we're going to use blood pressure as the example. So any type of stimulus might perhaps increase blood pressure. So for example, we'll look at the car crash perhaps. If you get into a car crash, that's going to significantly increase your blood pressure. If you're having some type of anxiety, perhaps because of any type of test or any type of results coming back on a test, those are going to be things that can increase blood pressure. So specific receptors that are found in our blood vessels are known as baroreceptors. This is just a type of specific receptor we have. These are going to be monitoring essentially the condition that we are looking at here. So these baroreceptors are going to be able to sense that blood pressure has increased. These baroreceptors are going to relay that signal up to the brain and tell the brain, hey, the blood pressure has increased. We need to essentially decrease this blood pressure. So the brain is then going to receive this and make the decision to send out to the effectors, which are the heart and the blood vessels, to produce different responses in order to reduce the blood pressure. So for example, the heart is going to essentially decrease its rate, which will decrease blood pressure, and the blood vessels are going to dilate, which means that they are going to open up and there's going to be more space inside, and both of these things will function to decrease blood pressure. So when blood pressure is going to be back, when this occurs, blood pressure will be then brought back to normal. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback loops function to essentially, when a condition is essentially changed, a negative feedback loop functions to immediately bring the controlled condition back to normal. That's different from a positive feedback loop. The function of a positive feedback loop is going to be to further amplify a response in order to bring it back to normal. So the example we have here is childbirth. So for example, one stimulus here is contractions of the uterine wall. When the baby is going to be essentially being pushed out of the uterus. The baby pushing into the walls of the uterus are going to constantly be essentially pushing against those walls. That is going to control or essentially increase our controlled condition of the cervical stretching. So when the cervix is stretched, that's going to contain different types of sensitive nerve cells. And these nerve cells are going to tell the brain to essentially release a hormone known as oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to function upon the muscles in the wall of the uterus to cause them to more forcefully contract. So when we go back up here, the baby is pushing along the cervix here. And this is going to cause the release of oxytocin, which is going to further produce muscle contractions. And when the muscle contractions are more forcefully progressing, this is going to essentially continue. And so the response here is going to increase the cervical stretching to produce more and more of this feedback loop. And of course, we need to be able to get out of this feedback loop. I don't think it'd be very beneficial if we were stuck in childbirth perpetually after this point. So the goal is when the cycle here is interrupted, that's going to decrease the stretching on the cervix. So when the baby is born and the baby is no longer pushing along the walls of the cervix, that's going to decrease this positive feedback loop. So this is an example of a positive feedback loop. So I want you to be able to understand the difference between a negative and a positive feedback loop for controlling homeostasis. Now, all the time we're undergoing different changes in homeostasis. Every day we undergo some types of homeostasis disruptions. Some of them are not very dangerous to the body. However, certain changes in homeostasis, if they are large enough, can really cause a lot of problems. So certain diseases, disorders, or perhaps even death can occur if homeostasis is disrupted too much. So different factors that are determining your genetic makeup are going to help to determine all of the things that make up. So the different factors that are in your genetic makeup, the food that you are eating, the specific air that you're breathing, and the contents of that air, those all affect your health. So it's important that we take these things very seriously when considering homeostasis. Our next major topic for this chapter is going to be the anatomical terminology. Now, I'm sure many of you are enrolled in the laboratory class as well, and lots of this anatomical terminology is going to be administered here in the first week for you guys. So I will be touching on certain anatomical terms that I find to be especially important, but some terms I'm going to leave for the lab class. So first and foremost, we're going to touch on the body position. And the body position of importance for us is the anatomical position. The anatomical position is essentially what is shown right here in this lower corner. The way we describe this model is going to be here. Now, the anatomical position is important because it's a method by which we can standardize observing the human body. If I was to raise my hands above my head in one picture and show you the anatomical picture in another picture, I would not be consistently showing the structures of the human body, because in one picture the hands would be above the head, and the other picture the hands would be below the head. So the anatomical position is important for us to standardize our methods of learning anatomy. So the way that we describe the anatomical position is standing erect, facing the observer, of course. So you can see that this model is nicely in the anatomical position. But the upper extremities are placed at the sides and the palms are turned forward. That is called supination, which we will touch on later. So this is going to be our anatomical position, standing up straight with the palms facing towards the front of the room. So this is going to be our anatomical position, and on every test that we take from here on out, you will be referring to the body in this anatomical position. All questions that I will ask will all refer to the body in that anatomical position. So regional names are going to be another thing that we're going to learn here in anatomy. Now, these are going to be more prominently shown in your lab class, so I'm going to leave these primarily for the lab class, but I'm going to take a few seconds to touch on some of these. So first and foremost, the head up here, this is the head, this is going to be referred to as the cephalic region. So these different regions are important. One condition that some newborns can have is known as hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is referring to water in the head. Hydro for water, cephalus for cephalic, or the head. So this is the cephalic region. The cervical region is the neck region. So this is another region that we have. We have the thoracic region, which is going to be the chest. The axillary region, which is going to be the armpit. We have the abdominal region and so forth. So there's a lot of different regions, but most of these you will touch on in your lab class. One last thing I want to mention is that in the anatomy class, we will refer to the arm as the upper limb, and we refer to the leg as the lower limb. So these are the way that we refer to each of these arms here in this class. So if I do say arm or leg or upper limb or lower limb, we can all be on the same page with what it is we're mentioning. Next up are the directional terms. Now, I personally find the directional terms to be extremely, extremely important for referencing the body. So we're going to take some time to go over these directional terms. There are quite a few directional terms that we're going to refer to, and these directional terms help us to locate one part of the body in reference to another part of the body. So one example that we'll use here is on the right side, superior and inferior. These are two words that are going to refer to the upper side of the body versus the lower side. So the further we go up the structure, let me pull this little pen out here. The further we go up the structure, like so, the more superior we get. The further we go below the structure, or towards the bottom of the structure, the more inferior we get. So if I was to show you the head up here, we were to point to the head up here, and I was to show you the chest, it's a rough arrow, let's do that like this, and I was to show you the chest right here, and I was to ask you which is going to be more superior, the answer is going to be the head. So the head is more superior than the chest, or the head is superior to the chest. Now we can also say that the chest is going to be inferior to the head. So we can reference the head, we can reference the chest, or the thoracic region, I should say. We could reference the pelvis here, for example. Each of these are in reference to each other. So the further up a structure we go, the more to the top of the structure, the more superior we get. And the further to the bottom of the structure, the more inferior we get. And this is easy to remember because when something is superior, it is above other things. So we can remember superior is at the top. Another example here is medial and lateral. Medial refers to the midline of the structure. And again, you can see our body here is in anatomical position, and so we draw the midline right down the center. So the closer to the midline we get, the more medial we are. However, on either side, whichever side we go towards, whether it be to the right or the left, the further out we go, the more lateral we get. And lateral means on the side. So medial and lateral are going to be opposing terms. And that's what all of these directional terms do. They oppose one another. As for example, as you become less lateral, you become more medial at the same time. As you become less medial, you become more lateral. So these are our second opposing terms. So superior and inferior are our first terms. Medial and lateral are going to be our second group of terms. Next is going to be proximal and distal, and these are referring to our extremities. So for example, the arms and the legs, the upper and lower limbs. Proximal refers closer to the point of origin. So for example, this is going to be the point of origin of our arm. So the further up the arm we go, the more proximal we have become. The further down the arm we go, the more distal we become. So this is a very, very distal part of the arm. So if we were to draw, let's say, the wrist here, and we were to draw the fingers, and we were to draw the elbow, we will say that the elbow is proximal to both the wrist as well as the fingers. We will say that the wrist is going to be proximal to the fingers, however, it is going to be distal to the elbow. The fingers, or the phalanges as we call them, are going to be distal to both the wrist and the elbow. So I know that these terms tend to be a little bit more difficult to understand, so make sure you take some time, go back and rewatch this part of the class if you have to understand that the further up the arm we go, the more proximal we get, and the further down the arm or further down the leg we go, the more distal we're going to be. So again, we have superior and inferior. These are going to be two terms that we've just talked about on our last slide. Superior is more towards the head. Inferior is more towards the lower part of the structure. Now, anterior and posterior are going to be two other words. Anterior, also known as ventral, and posterior, also known as dorsal with the human body. These are going to be referring to front and back. So the more towards the front we go, the more anterior we've become, and the more towards the back we go, the more posterior we've become. So you can see that anterior refers to the front of the body, posterior refers to the back of the body. So for example, the sternum or the nose are going to be very anterior structures, while the spinal column is going to be a very posterior structure. And we've already touched on medial and we've already touched on lateral as well. So these other terms here are going to be terms that we will touch on a little bit later. They're a little bit more advanced, but I'll take some time here to just go over these three here. So intermediate means that something is between two structures. So we could say that, for example, the sternum is going to be intermediate to the two lungs. So that's one example we will use this term in. Ipsilateral means that something's on the same side of the body, while contralateral means that something's on opposite sides of the body. So ipsilateral, for example, the right and left, the right arm and the right leg are going to be ipsilateral to one another, while the right arm and the left leg are going to be contralateral to one another. Now, I'm not going to stress these three terms very much. Again, these are a bit more advanced terms, and we will touch on these at a later time. But here's proximal and distal. And our last major group of opposing terms is going to be superficial and deep. So superficial means that something is more closer located towards the surface of the body. So superficial is going to be something like our skin, our eyes, our eyelashes, and our hair are all going to be very superficial structures. While deep structures are going to be found towards the inside of the body or away from the surface of the body. So our heart and our lungs are going to be very deep structures. So we might say that our heart is going to be deep to our thoracic cage, while the skin is going to be superficial to the thoracic cage. So these are the way that we will use these two terms here. Now, one thing I'd like to just mention here for your information, again, I'm not going to ask this here on your test, but I do want you to be aware of this. I mentioned earlier that our terms anterior and posterior are also going to be known as ventral and dorsal. So anterior meaning towards the front of the body, posterior meaning towards the back of the body. Ventral in the human also is going to be referring to the front of the body, while posterior and dorsal are meaning towards the back of the body. This is the same thing in humans. However, in our four-legged animals, where the belly side is going to be inferior, those are going to have different, we're going to sort of be referring to these a little bit differently. So for example, dorsal is really truly going to be referring to the backside, and therefore in the human, our backside is posterior. However, in something like a dolphin, the dorsal fin is actually going to be more superior. So that's just a little bit of information for you all. Again, I'm not going to ask you this concept here on your test, but I want you to know the different terms of these different directionals. I want you to know these different directional terms. Next up are going to be the different planes and sections. So different planes and sections are the way that we separate the body to be able to get different views of the body and to see what structures are found inside. So you can see that a few of the planes are going to be shown right here. So first and foremost is going to be the sagittal plane, or the mid-sagittal plane, as I like to call this. The sagittal plane, or the mid-sagittal plane, is essentially going to split the body into two right and left pieces. The mid-sagittal plane separates the body right down the center. And so this is a very nice view when we need to view things like brain structures, or perhaps other structures that are found here within the different body cavities. So the sagittal plane separates the body into two different sides. The parasagittal plane is going to be sort of in the same orientation as the mid-sagittal plane. However, the mid-sagittal plane is directly through the midline, while the parasagittal plane is going to be anywhere towards the side. So you can see that the parasagittal plane is going to be more laterally located here. You see what I'm using my terms there. I'm going to be using these terms here throughout the class, so it's important that you guys have a good grasp on these terms. This parasagittal plane is going to be a little bit more laterally located, or to the side, than the mid-sagittal plane. So these are our first plane we want to mention. We also have the transverse plane, which goes towards essentially across the body. The transverse plane separates the body into superior and inferior pieces, or a top and bottom half. This plane is very nice when used to view the different muscles that are found in the forearm. There are many different muscles that are found within the forearm, and they're very much easier to view from this particular plane. So the transverse plane goes from right to left, or sort of splits the body into a top and bottom piece. The frontal plane is going to separate the body into an anterior and posterior piece. So the frontal plane slices right through the body and separates the body into a front half and a back half. And then lastly, we have the oblique plane, which is just any plane that doesn't fit within the realm of these other three. I will not be asking you many oblique planes, but again, for your information, when you look at the medical imaging slides, lots of medical imaging slides can be viewed in oblique planes. So these are going to be the major ones I'd like you to know: the mid-sagittal, parasagittal, transverse, and frontal planes. We can also call the frontal plane a coronal plane. Let me write that all down here so you guys can see that here. We have the frontal plane can also be known as a coronal plane. Now, I'm not an expert here at writing here on these slides, but I do my best. So just bear with me on here. So the coronal plane is also going to be known as the frontal plane. So these are exactly the same. I can refer to these as either one on the test. I really like this name here, so make sure you're comfortable with this name here, coronal plane. That means the same thing as the frontal plane. So here's some examples. You can see a mid-sagittal section is going to show us the brain in this view. You can see that we've sliced right through the midline, and now we are able to see lots of different brain structures. And so this right now I'm sure doesn't look like much to you, but when we get to chapter 14 and we start learning about the different brain structures, a lot of the stuff in here is going to make a lot more sense to you. The frontal plane, or the coronal plane, as I showed on the last class, is going to give us a view like so. So this is the way that we will slice through the brain. This is our anterior side here of our brain and our posterior side. So the frontal or coronal plane gives us a front and back half of the body. The transverse plane is going to give us a top and half body, or it's going to be going through the side transversely. So this gives us a view like this. So you can see that each of these planes allows us to view the brain differently. We're able to see different structures based on the particular plane that we are using. Next up are going to be the different body cavities. The different body cavities are going to be such as the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, as well as the pelvic cavity. So what's important to note about the different body cavities are the different contents within each cavity. So we're going to go over each of these cavities, and we're going to talk about their contents as well. And I've actually left out a few cavities here that I always seem to leave out at first, and that is the cranial and the vertebral canal. So there are several different types of cavities. These are actually known as dorsal cavities, and these are known as ventral cavities. However, I don't think that that's very, very important. I just want to mention that these are dorsal because they're located more towards the back. Now, the cranial cavity is going to, of course, be this space found in the skull that's going to be housing the brain. So the contents of the cranial cavity are the brain. We also do have certain cranial nerves that are going to be exiting the cranial cavity, but for our purposes, I just want you to know that the brain is going to be included here within the cranial cavity, and it's formed by the different cranial bones that make up the skull. Now, the vertebral canal is going to be this little tube, or we could say this little canal that's running down here through the vertebral column. So this is the vertebral column. Each one of these bones in here is known as a vertebrae. And there's going to be this space running down the center of this. And we'll get a lot more better views of these as we go through this class. But for right now, bear with me when I say that there is this space running here through the spinal column. And through this space is going to be the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be the major component of the vertebral canal. So the cranial cavity contains the brain. The vertebral canal contains the spinal cord. Now, the thoracic cavity is going to be this blue cavity shown up here. And we also have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can further be split up into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So this is going to be where things get a little bit more choppy here, but bear with me as I go through each of these. So the thoracic cavity is shown in blue, and the contents are also going to be shown over here in blue. The major components of our thoracic cavity are going to be our heart and our lungs. Those are going to be their two most major components that are found here within the thoracic cavity. Now, around the thoracic cavity are going to be other cavities. Found within the thoracic cavity are going to be a pleural cavity, a pericardial cavity, as well as a space known as the mediastinum. So the thoracic cavity is going to be containing the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, and the mediastinum. So all of these cavities are contained within the thoracic cavity. So I know that this might be a little confusing because we can't see these other cavities, but I do have another picture for you all about this in just a few slides. So the pleural cavity is going to be made up of what is known as pleura. Pleura are these different membranes that are going to be wrapping around the lungs. And again, I've got a picture for those for you on those in just a few slides. So the pleural cavity wraps around the lungs, while the pericardial cavity is going to be sort of a similar concept, but it just wraps around the heart. And the mediastinum is going to be a portion found in the center that actually is going to contain the heart. It's going to be a little space that's found here in the center. And so this is going to contain lots of different things here, but I want you to get an idea of the pleural and the pericardial cavities. So cardial here means heart, so the pericardial cavity is going to be found around the heart. One of the things that I want you guys to focus most readily on here in our class is that when we look at different terms here, I know a lot of these terms might seem really confusing. You've never seen a lot of these before, and that's okay. But one thing that we'll learn is that most of the terms we will learn are going to actually have insight as to what the structure is or what the function of that particular thing is doing. So for example, the pericardial cavity is on the sides of the heart. Peri for on the sides, cardial for the heart. So this is a space that's found on the side of the heart. And that's how we want to logic through some of these different statements here. Now the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be split into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So the abdominal cavity is going to be found up here more in the abdominal region, or the sort of where your abdomen is, and the pelvic region is going to be found here closer to the pelvis. So the abdominal cavity is going to contain the stomach, the spleen, the liver, the gallbladder, the small intestine, most of our large intestine, as well as what is known as the peritoneum. Now I know there's a lot going on here with these different cavities, so let me break this down here. Most of our different organs are going to be found up here. Most of our different organs are found up here in the abdominal cavity. In the pelvic cavity, we have our urinary bladder, the other parts of the large intestine, and our reproductive organs. So the pelvic cavity has fewer components because it's a little smaller. And so if you can know these three, that will help you to reasonably assume what parts are going to be found within the pelvic versus the abdominal cavity. So I do want you to know the different components of these as we go. So I also mentioned this thing here known as the peritoneum, so I'm going to touch on that. The peritoneum is essentially the same concept as the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. However, this is just going to wrap around the intestines. So I'm going to show you each of these different serous membranes, as they're called, the pleura, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. I'm going to show you those in later slides. So, perfect place to jump into our serous membranes is serous membranes are referring to different, essentially double layers of membranes. So with every serous membrane, there's two different membranes. And we can look at serous membranes as sort of a balloon that has been sort of impressed upon itself. If we've pushed our hand into a balloon, there's going to be an outer layer of that balloon and an inner layer of that balloon that's now contacting our hand. And I have a picture for serous membranes for you guys in just a second. The inner layer is what's known as the visceral layer, and the outer layer is known as the parietal layer. So the way we want to look at all of these membranes are as if they are balloons. And we've taken our heart and we've sort of pushed the heart into the side of the balloon, pushing it towards the center. And we have this outer layer and this inner layer. One layer is going to be on the outside, and the inner layer is contacting the heart itself. And so that's how we are going to function with these. Now, it's important that we have these serous membranes because their main function is going to be to reduce friction within the body. If we didn't have these serous membranes, every time we moved around and jostled the inner contents of our bodies, we would be grinding our organs past each other. And that'd be causing a lot of damage to our organs, and it'd be really causing a lot of scar tissue to arise. So these serous membranes allow for the reduction of friction as we move our bodies around. These allow for these different organs to run past each other very smoothly. So this is one example that we see here with serous membranes. So allow me to go over the different, the pericardial and the pleural cavity in this example. You can see here we have the mediastinum. The mediastinum is this space that's found here between the lungs that contains the heart. That's the mediastinum right here. And there's a lot of stuff that's included here in the mediastinum. But for our purposes, I really want you to focus on the pleura and the pericardium. So this is where we're going to find our lungs here on either side, and this is where we're going to find our heart. So the way that we want to look at these serous membranes is we'll look here at the lungs. So this is the right pleural cavity. Now this might be a little confusing because we're looking at the left side of the page. With the anatomical position, we need to be able to reverse our directions. So with the anatomical position, as I mentioned, our model is going to be looking at us. And we refer to our patient's right lung as the right side of the body. So even though we are looking upon this body, and this is on our left side, this is actually the right lung. So the right lung is going to be found here in blue. And you can see that we have this purple line here, sort of these two black lines here that are encasing this purple here. And you can look as if these are a balloon. So these pleural cavity is going to be surrounding the different lungs, and we have this inner layer that's sort of touching the lung itself, and this is known as the visceral layer. You can see that this is the visceral pleura, because pleura wrap around the lungs. And then we have this outer layer out here that's going to be referred to as the parietal pleura. So the parietal pleura is going to be found here on this outer layer. So these two layers are very close to each other, but one of these layers contacts the organ itself, and one is going to be found a little bit more, we will say, superficially. Now, the pericardium is going to be the serous membrane that wraps around the heart. You can see this inner layer here is the visceral pericardium because it contacts the organ. And we have this outer layer, which is known as the parietal pericardium. So each of these different layers here is going to be a different part of the pericardium. So between the visceral and parietal layers, we have the pericardial cavity. So in this reddish, rusty color in here, this is our pericardial cavity, while this bluish color here is showing us our pleural cavity. So the pericardium is going to cover up the heart, the pleura are going to cover up the lungs. And these are our serous membranes that are going to be found here within the thoracic cavity. Now, as we look here with our peritoneum, oh, I'm so sorry, I've jumped the gun here. This is just another example to show you this is actually the heart and the lungs here in the thoracic cavity. We're going to touch on the peritoneum in just a second. So here you can see the left pleural cavity right here. We can actually see that we're looking, this is the posterior side of the body, and this is the anterior side of the body. So we actually are looking at what is known as an inferior view. So we're actually looking up at this body. You can see the view is actually looking up at this thoracic cavity. So you can see the left pleural cavity right here. You can see the right pleural cavity here. And you can also see the pericardial cavity in this example as well. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different organs and such. We have our heart found right here in the center, and we have our lungs found on either side. And each is given their respective serous membrane with their respective cavities. So this is our serous membrane in the abdominal cavity is the peritoneum. So we're finally going to get to the peritoneum. So this is actually, just for your information, whenever I was studying this class years ago, I actually also used this same picture to learn the peritoneum. So the peritoneum is going to be the same type of idea. It's going to be this sort of balloon structure that's going to sort of be wrapping up all of the structures in the abdominal cavity. So the peritoneum will wrap the different organs that are found here or we'll say some of the different organs that are found here within our abdominal cavity. Now, certain organs are going, you can see, actually, let me touch on this here. The visceral peritoneum is actually going to be found contacting our organ, while the parietal peritoneum is going to be found here on the outside. You can see the parietal peritoneum is shown here in blue, wrapping around the outside, while these organs are going to be suspended within this massive balloon-like structure. And the visceral peritoneum is going to be actually shown right here on the actual structures themselves. So the visceral layer is going to be contacting the organ. The parietal layer is going to be the outer layer. So with the peritoneum specifically, we have a few different words that we're going to use. We have intraperitoneal, retroperitoneal, and infraperitoneal organs. All of these are referring to the location of where these organs are. So the infraperitoneal organs are going to be organs that are found within the peritoneum. Oh, I'm so sorry, the intra, I said infra. Oh, this is the intraperitoneal because these are found inside of the peritoneum. Pardon my mistake there. The infraperitoneal organs are going to be found below, just as they are inferior to the peritoneum. So again, the intra are found on the interior, the infra are found inferior. That's the way we would distinguish these. The retroperitoneal organs are going to be found towards the back or behind, posterior to our peritoneum. So these are different examples of our different peritoneum. Now this is going to take us into our abdominal pelvic regions and our abdominal pelvic quadrants. So what I'd like you to note as we go through each of these regions and quadrants is what organs are going to be found in each one. So let's start over here with the quadrants, because these tend to be a little bit more simple. The quadrants are nicely shown. Again, we're looking at this body in the anatomical position. This is the body's right side, and this is the body's left side. So we call this the right upper quadrant. We call this the right lower quadrant. So I don't think that's too difficult. And the center point will be found on the umbilicus or the belly button. So the left upper quadrant and the left lower quadrant are going to be found down here. So you can see that the liver is going to be mostly found up here in the right upper quadrant. The gallbladder is going to be found in the right upper quadrant, while the stomach is going to be primarily found in the left upper quadrant. So the quadrants tend to be a little bit more straightforward as they are named essentially where the quadrant is found. Now the abdominal pelvic regions are going to be a little bit different. So when we get into our regions, we're going to start giving different names to our different parts of the body. So as we look here with the abdominal pelvic regions, we're separating the abdominal pelvic region into 9 subregions. So I like to start here at the umbilical region found in the center. The umbilical region is primarily going to be containing the small intestine. And again, you can see that many different organs are going to be found in multiple different quadrants and multiple different regions, but we want to look at the regions and quadrants that these organs are most commonly found in. So with the umbilical region as our reference point, as we go to the right or left, we're going to call this the right and left lumbar regions. Now, the lower back is referring to our lumbar region. And essentially we have certain vertebrae that are found in the lumbar region. Our last separate vertebrae that we have before we get to what is known as the sacrum. And there are going to be 5 of these lumbar vertebrae, and these are going to be found coursing down this region. So we call the side regions here the right lumbar and left lumbar regions. If we go above the umbilical region, we're going to be going into what is known as the epigastric region. Now this prefix here, epi, means on top of or on the outside of. So epigastric is going to be on top of the umbilical region. So epi for on top. That's how you guys can remember this. This is also known as the epigastric region. The gastric region is referring to the stomach. So the epigastric region will contain most of the stomach right here above the umbilical region. And on either side, we have the hypochondriac regions. That's what's found on either side of the epigastric region. As we go below the umbilical region, we have the hypogastric region. Hypo means low. If we have hypothermia, that means we have too low of a temperature. So the hypogastric region is going to be found below the gastric or the umbilical region. So the hypogastric region is found down here, and on either side, we have the right and left inguinal region. So I know there's a lot of different regions here, but again, if you use the umbilical region as a reference point, a lot of these different regions will seem a lot more clear. So lastly, to sum up our first chapter here is aging and homeostasis. Aging and homeostasis is going to be a theme that we're going to stick to throughout our classes. Aging is normal. This, of course, is going to happen to all of us. We're all going to have to age. And as we age, there is going to be a constant progressive decline in our body's ability to maintain homeostasis and restore homeostasis when there are deviations from homeostasis. So it's important to keep this in mind as we go on. Most of our chapters are going to be touching on how, all of these things that we have are going to be functioning a little less efficiently as we get older. So with that, I'm just going to mention real quickly that medical imaging slides are shown here. There's a lot of good information here about our medical imaging, but I will not be going over this and I will not be requiring this on my test. So I thank you all for your attention, and I will see you all in the next video.